I'm also the regional coordinator, and I'm going to put my information in the chat to everyone. So yeah, I'm, as I said, the regional coordinator for the Finger Lakes region. So if anything comes up related to NYAPRS, please feel free to get a hold of me if you have questions or whatnot. For those of you who might not be familiar with NYAPRS, it stands for New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. It's a nonprofit providing advocacy, technical assistance, and training with the aim of improving services and ultimately people's lives who are affected by mental health and or addiction challenges. And I am very excited to share some award announcements. NYAPRS has annual awards, and it's hot off the press. Lori Drescher has won the Partners with Families Award. Very excited about that. And Stanley Martin has won the Quincy Boykin Memorial Award. We're very excited and honored to have Stanley here today as well. And so I'd like to just take a moment to thank everyone who helped put this together. And I'll just name them, and then if they'd like to introduce themselves real quickly, that would be great. Matthew Petit is the director of Core Center. Stanley Martin is a lead organizer of Free the People Rock. And Melissa Holloway is a medical student at the U of R involved with Health and Incarceration Connection. I don't know if any of you want to say a few words. Stanley, would you like to start it off?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for the work NYAPRS does to ensure that we are allowing people in our community to access peer services at the highest level. I'm a certified recovery peer advocate, and I'm also a lead organizer with Free the People Rock and also with Vocal New York, organizations that really prioritize ensuring that people with lived experience are at the front line. Nothing that is done to provide services for folks in our community should be done without including their lived experiences. So I'm glad to be here and talk more about this throughout our program today. Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I want to reiterate, thank you for the collaboration, Cameron, and your work on this too. So I'm a medical student at the University of Rochester and one of the leaders of the Health and Incarceration Connection Group. And we similarly have a mission to make sure we're really driven by those with lived experience and are trying to change policies and kind of change the landscape of healthcare in a way that's beneficial to people who are justice involved.
Wonderful, thank you. And Matthew?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm the project director here at the Core Center through Center for Community Alternatives, and I'm just very happy to join this group today. There's a bunch of issues that are personal to me, someone with lived experience, someone who's been incarcerated, someone who's dealt with mental health issues and substance use issues. So I really appreciate this group coming together, and for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and feel free as an attendee, if you're, as you're watching, you can introduce yourself in the chat, share where you're from, maybe what your role is. And I'd also like to finally introduce Harvey Rosenthal, who is the CEO of NYAPRS, who will be our moderator and provide some more information on kind of setting the tone of what we'll be covering today.
Thank you, Stanley. Welcome, everybody. This is really an important and exciting event because we're really talking about human suffering and tragedy and trying to turn that into safety, healing, recovery, and community success. So we're really excited about really bringing up a number of the issues that are current right now. And we have powerful speakers, powerful leaders, again, on a powerful program. And the senator should be joining us shortly, they tell me. But our goal is to explore a number of emerging practices And we hope that they're adopted not only in the Finger Lakes, but beyond. We hope to have a practical impact on those of you that are listening. And by the way, I looked at who's here. We have so many friends, old and new. We have legal rights advocates and county officials and SAMHSA grantees and peer agency leads and crisis intervention team folks, and even our lobbyists. So I hope I do good because our lobbyist is watching. But anyway, I'm Harvey Rosenthal. I am a person in long-term recovery. I have been in the field in one way or the other. I began in a hospital. I worked in the site. I mean, I was a patient in a hospital originally back in the day. And then I eventually worked in the state hospital here in Albany. And really, eventually we've worked, one of our central themes is to help folks leave and stay out of hospital. And so I'm with the New York Association of Psych Rehab Services. I'm going to lead you on mission. We are a peer-led change agent dedicated to improving services, public policies, and social conditions for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma-related challenges by promoting health, wellness, rights, and recovery with full community inclusion so all may achieve maximum potential in communities of choice. Okay, everybody repeat that with me. That's a bit much, right? But it is our mission. It's deep in our hearts to help this community that we're a part of to really achieve health and recovery and to really focus on rights and choice and community inclusion. And that includes folks of culture, of gender preference, the whole range of people that are in our community. On behalf of our board and staff, I want to thank you again for joining us. And our program is packed. It's standard NYAPRS program, too many topics, too many speakers, not too much time. So I'm going to keep everybody within a tight sort of time frame. And Steve is going to keep me in a tight time frame because I'm the one you got to watch. I'm hoping to, there she is. Okay, Senator Brooke, thank you for joining us. I'm about to introduce you. Perfect timing. Hi, Senator. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to read a little bio about, because I did a little research and there's some really interesting things here. Senator Brooke represents New York's 55th district, which includes portions of Monroe, Ontario counties, and the areas of Rush, Mendon, Pittsford, and Perinton. Hope I got that right. Fairport, Penfield, East Rochester, East Arundecoit, Naples, Bloomfield, Victor, and the east side of the city of Rochester. She's the daughter of Ethiopian immigrants, and she was born and raised in Rochester and nearby Pittsford. She graduated from Williams College and served in the Peace Corps, especially in the devastating aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. She organized a month-long trip to Mississippi, where she and her classmates helped to remove mold from damaged homes and assisted FEMA with paperwork to help hurricane victims. She worked 3 jobs to make ends meet and pay for her college tuition. So she knows of what we experience and what we speak. She's always worked to provide quality of services and greater opportunities, vital support to people in need. That dedication has led her to work closely with local governments, improve services for people who are aging within their homes, and address inequalities in the public school system. As a leader in nonprofit community development, she spent decades developing educational, environmental, and senior services initiatives. She is the chair, and we're so happy about this. She is the chair of the Senate Mental Health Committee and a member also of the Senate Aging Committee, Alcoholism and Substance Use Committee, Education Committee, Elections Committee, Health Committee, and the Women's Issues Committee. So you can tell by that she's a tireless servant of the community. She co-wrote legislation that would create a Black Youth Suicide Prevention Task Force, established a working group on essential workers' mental health during the pandemic. Her priorities include the closing of the equity gap in education. Oh boy, that's one of our speakers. During the pandemic, her priority, I did that, raising wages for workers, addressing climate change, ensuring adequate senior care. But she did some really important things. I'm new to the senator, but it didn't take long to see that she was a great leader. You hit the ground running, Senator. You immediately were talking about crisis services and 988, which you'll talk about today, and Daniel's Law, and working on the COLA And we talked once about really trying to increase the number of people in color in management and leadership positions. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Sandler-Brook.
Thank you so much, Harvey. What an introduction. Wow. You went deep into the deep cuts of some of those early wins, which I am certainly very proud of. And, as you described it, it really does all those, kind of working in all these different angles on some of the major issues that our society is facing do prepare you for sitting in this position. And I think I'm honored that you've enjoyed working with us and my team in this first year or so. And you're absolutely right. I think a lot of us step into these positions and we already know what's wrong. That's why we wanted to be in these positions. And so when finally given the opportunity and the power and the influence to push some of that change, we're not really waiting for permission. We are jumping in, and I know I speak for a lot of us on this call who feel similarly that time is long past overdue. We're on borrowed time with some of these issues and some of these crises we face. And so we try to do everything we can every day to move us in the right direction. So I'll jump in and talk. You mentioned the 988 specifically, and I want to just jump in and talk about that for a bit. And first, I just want to take a step back to just make sure everyone's clear on my position as chair of the Senate Mental Health Committee and really what my approach has been, because it really does fall in line with why we had to push so hard. And thank you to so many of you on this call that helped us get this over the finish line and signed into law. And that's really around my three major focuses as chair of the Mental Health Committee in the Senate. One is about helping our young people. We know that there is a lack of school psychologists, social workers, culturally competent care for our young folks, especially having gone through one of the most anxiety-ridden times of their poor little lives. And now they're meant to move on, right, and jump back into school and be well-adjusted. And we know that just doesn't happen. They're going to need extra support. So that's one of my top priorities. The other one I just mentioned about culturally competent care. This is something I'm learning more about every single day, and it's something that we really need to address at every level of care in the mental health continuum of care, if we like to call it that. It needs to be culturally competent. We need linguistic competence. We need someone, when they show up as a professional, to have some sort of understanding of who they're working with and what that means to a patient or a client or someone in need of those services, to have someone who sees them and knows them and can understand what they're showing up with is really important. That goes directly to getting more people, as Harvey talked about, getting more people into these fields, which means, yes, paying them living wages. And that means COLA and other things to try to get more folks into this field and to stay in the field. And the third and perhaps biggest and most pertinent to our conversation today is around mental health crisis. We all know I represent half of the city of Rochester, but the truth is, if you represent any part of Rochester, this city is yours. This city is our responsibility. And it was gut-wrenching to be a part of international news, to be talking about the killing of Daniel Prude here in Rochester. And so this is something that is still raw for our city. And when I joined this Senate and really asked to be chair of this committee, this is what I had in mind, was how do I use this position to change the way we deal with mental health crisis in this state? And how do we create a model so that people all over the country can look to New York and learn from what we're doing and do better? Because the truth is, when we mess this up, people lose their lives. Every day that we haven't figured this out, people lose their lives. They don't get the care they need. And so with the 988 crisis hotline, one of the reasons it was so important that we got that passed this year and didn't wait until next year is because, according to the federal act that went into place in October of 2022, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, 988 would become a nationwide suicide prevention line, a nationwide mental health crisis line. And if New York State didn't start acting immediately on setting up that line, making sure we had the infrastructure, making sure that we were hiring the mental health providers to pick up those phone calls or answer those text messages, we may have put ourselves in a position where come July 2022, when we are supposed to have all of this up and running and 988 is up and running, we'd be behind. And again, I always feel like we need to remind ourselves when we say we're behind, when we say we're not quite hitting the mark, these are lives. That's what this work is. It's showing up for people who are in these moments of mental health or substance use crisis. That's why we really wanted to push to get this done this year. We want to make sure we're building that infrastructure, and we need people all over the state to understand that this is the direction we're going. This really builds on a lot of the work that we did in the New York State budget. It was such an honor to be able to sit and negotiate these crucial pieces of New York State budget for mental health this year. And in case you didn't know, and many of you probably know already, we are in a crisis in this state. Over the past several decades, we have a state government that has been siphoning away mental health resources. And now we find ourselves in a position where I am fighting tooth and nail to get any gain possible in funding for mental health. And we're dealing with a moment we have heightened need for mental health right now in our state. So through the budget process, a few things we were able to do, which I truly believe are shifting the paradigm of how folks are thinking about mental health crisis, is these things called crisis stabilization centers. And the easiest way I like to describe these for folks is that it's like urgent care, but for mental health. And a lot of the work that we do is trying to destigmatize it. So you dislocate your shoulder, you don't want to go to the emergency room, so you go to urgent care, they get you taken care of, you've got a sling, you move on with your day. We should be able to destigmatize it and create enough of these stabilization centers so that someone who might be going through the equivalent of that, but for a mental illness or a mental health crisis, has a safe place to go where they can get the care that they need. And they don't necessarily need to be hospitalized for days on end. They need the care in that moment. And that's part of what we're trying to create here, this continuum of care, so that we're not leaving people at the end of this cliff without any resources to get them through to that safe space, that cool down, de-escalated place to move on and get the rest of the ongoing care that they need. So things like these crisis stabilization centers, I see it as a really promising thing, because we agreed, all of us agreed, all three chambers agreed in the New York State budget that this was something worth continuing to build. And once we start creating that piece of the puzzle, it makes sense then, right, to have a 988 line where folks are going to actually take these calls and intake people who might need this help and be able to send them somewhere where it makes sense for them to go to get the care that they need. So these are all the different pieces of what we're trying to create. We know that there's lots of pieces of the puzzle that are missing right now and how we're caring for people who find themselves in a mental health or substance use crisis. And while we can't do it all at once, I think we have made really important steps to make sure that people do start getting the care. But I want to also share with you that this work is so far from over. Yes, it was a win to get crisis stabilization centers in the budget. OMH is actually going to look into how we can build these centers, how they can be sustainable. But we don't have full funding for these yet, and we have to figure that out. And that's where a lot of the advocacy over the next year can come into play. The other thing we really need to talk about is with 988. We have the bill, it's signed into law. Our next step is we have to get the budget line that we need for this 988. And we have to be careful to account for the professionals that we need, the training that we need, and the fact that we want these people hired in New York State. We know that New York State has the talent of people who care about this issue and want to help. They need good training, they need livable wages, and they need a path to how they can sit in these positions. And then we need to retain them in these positions. So that's the other piece that we really need to focus on going into next year, is truly how do we ensure that we don't let 988 be some sort of theoretical bill? How do we make sure that it actually is put into practice and that it serves New Yorkers who need it? So I will count on many of you to be with me next year as we think through how to create that funding. And I think this goes perfectly into a bill that we'll talk about in a little bit, I know, but I think the big piece here, which I hope is promising for all of you, is that we are now talking about mental health and mental health crisis in a way that has never been largely accepted or acknowledged at the state level. And I think a lot of you are to thank for that work. you all really set the stage. You created an environment for someone like me to step in and really run with what we've been trying to build on a grassroots level. And I think that even in this first, 8 months, in this position, we've been able to do tremendous things that I can just share with you candidly. I've talked to people who thought, I don't know why you're bothered. Don't bother trying. No one's going to budge on this. But the truth is, we bothered trying and people budged on it. And so I think that we have an incredible opportunity now to keep pushing on these things. I think we need to stay focused. And the last thing I'll say is, I talked at the beginning about what it meant to be culturally competent and what it means to have a diverse field of mental health providers. That is something we have to remain committed to. None of these things work if we're not putting the right people in these positions. We don't want to make the mistakes that other industries have made when trying to solve this issue. And so that's the other big piece that we're going to need to be partners on, that really will feed into us being able to be successful with this work. I think you're muted, Harvey, but I see your mouth moving.
My mouth always moves, Senator. No, but thank you so much. That was so powerful. And your words are also lead to your actions. You're very passionate, and you did. Had it not been for you, we wouldn't have gotten 988 in the budget. And hopefully the federal dollars will jumpstart it. Hopefully Medicaid and commercial insurance will pick it up. But the same with 988 and the COLA. We opened the mail today. Actually, it was yesterday. And the COLA was in our mailbox. And I'm sure it was in everybody's mailbox. And it wouldn't happen without you. You at the last minute really made it happen. So I just want to thank you on behalf of all these agencies and people who are vastly underpaid, and agencies who are right to the door. 1% is a start, but without you, we wouldn't have gotten that. And it's permanent. So that's really, it's terribly important. How do you think, let me ask, and if folks want to put some questions in the chat box, Senator's with us for another, 20 minutes. So as many as 20. So feel free to speak to your senator if you're in the Finger Lakes, or speak to our mental health leader if you're elsewhere in the state. You mentioned Daniel Prude. Really, that tragedy was so heartbreaking and changed the face, I think, for many of us about what has to, made it very clear. We've talked about crisis intervention in the past, but really that's not enough. And so you've really been looking at, other ways to send people out who are not just the police. And I know you're looking at ways to set and raise a standard for what happens in localities to try to respond to these kind of crises. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Daniel's Law, and I do have to give credit to all of the organizers and community activists, one of whom is one of my fellow panelists here today, Stanley, who worked so hard to really use community voice, trauma, and experience on what they envisioned, right? What they envisioned this could look like in a future where people aren't losing their lives when they're in a crisis, as Mr. Prude was. And I think that part of the work to, this bill is really about creating a state structure, to make a state framework so that localities can actually move forward with creating these teams. But part of that work has meant locally, at least, I can take advantage of being here in Rochester and in Monroe County, of looking at how some localities are already starting to do this. So I was recently able to go on a ride along with our person in crisis team here in Rochester. And I was able to join with a local assemblywoman, Sarah Clark, and we got to go, on with 2 social workers who worked. These 2 happened to work full time, but we learned a lot about how they're able to employ people, how funding affects that, how easy or difficult it is to find people to work in these positions. And one of the things that really, other than more funding, which we definitely need for these types of things, and hopefully something like Daniel's Law with that state structure and framework allows more funding to go towards these things. But one of the things you realize very, very quickly is truly the variety of calls that these folks are being called on, right? And to be honest, I really think about how this interacts with something like 988. So we're on calls where there is no central place that folks can call into. Sometimes it's 211, sometimes it's 911, and then they have to go through their processes to figure out who gets sent to these calls. And what you realize is sometimes these social workers are exactly who needs to show up. And sometimes it probably could have gotten resolved over the phone with a trained mental health professional. Of course, that would be 988. I'll share that one of the things that was really fascinating to me, we did hold a public hearing on mental health crisis and emergency services back in May. And one of the things that stood out to me from current call centers was this statistic that when folks call a line like a 988, it isn't exactly a parallel to 911. In other words, for 911, you get to a dispatcher to literally, right, dispatch someone to you. That is the end goal of a 911 call. For a 988 call, it is possible that a vast majority of these calls get settled right over the phone or via text. The person gets paired with the service that they need, the information they need, or they're de-escalated and able to move on, with their day in a safe manner. And so that's why I think that the 988 works so perfectly with something like this person in crisis team, because the hope would be that also alleviates the need to always send someone out. But the other thing I really noticed on, other than the variety of these calls, is just that right now it's also being used as this kind of stopgap for a lot of people, especially young people, especially children who are either on wait lists. And I know we all know the stories of 6-month wait lists to get, the help that you're looking for, to get in to see a psychiatrist or whoever it is that you need. But they're using these emergency services, families are, because they have nowhere else to go, right? There's no fast track through the line to get, a therapist or a counselor. And we know that's because there's a massive shortage of counselors and therapists in our area, and I'm certain across the country as well. So that's the other thing that really stood out to me in terms of how some of these teams are approaching this work. And I think they understand it too, right? They want backup. They wish that it didn't have to be an emergency every time there's, a flare up in a family, but rather there's a constant practitioner or provider that family can call. And so, certainly these are things that I think we need to address. And the goal would be, when we're able to have some of these folks bringing these learnings into Daniel's Law, when Daniel's Law passes and they're able to be a part of that conversation, we get to create this statewide framework and really finally give this the attention it needs.
We're looking forward to working with you on it, Senator. Stanley, I just want to acknowledge you just got an award for NYAPRS, and it's really to be a passionate rights advocate to make sure people of every kind get the supports and services and respect and dignity. But you were on the streets after the killing of Daniel Prude. So was Matthew, so was Chaco Mathai. I see him in the chat box, and other, Cameron, other people from Rochester. What was that like for you? And follow-up question for both you and the senator, the issue of race in general. How do you see it playing out? I have another question on that from Chaco. I hope to get in.
So I would first like to say thank you so much for this recognition. I feel that I am who I am because of the community around me, people who stood with us in the streets like Shaku, like Matthew, like Cameron, who relentlessly demanded more from our leaders and were willing to put their lives and bodies on the line to demand that. And with every honor I get, I also want to pass that on to the Prude family, Joe Prude and Valerie Prude, for their resilience, their bravery. In the midst of such deep trauma, they decided to stand up, fight back, and lead a movement. So always grateful for this community. When I think about the role of racism in accessing services, especially as it comes to what happened to Daniel Prude and the passage of Daniel's Law, I think a lot about how we've been socialized to equate public safety with policing, especially when it comes to Black and Brown people and communities that have been systemically marginalized and excluded through redlining, the medical apartheid, capitalism, and so many other forms of systemic violence. We know that half of people who become victims of police violence have a disability, and overwhelmingly it's a mental health disability or a substance use disorder. And when people happen to be at the intersection of being Black and having a mental health crisis or a mental health diagnosis, we find them to be at higher risk of experiencing police violence. Danielle's Law really aims to challenge this system of racism and creates culturally competent responses for Black and Brown people grounded in love, true safety, resources, and ensuring that people are seen as more than, their crises. They're seen as people who can recover, people who are complex beings, people who deserve real care. So instead of sending police officers who we know are violence workers based on them having guns, based on their trainings to respond to mental health crises, we prefer to have peers with lived experience, people who know what it's like to be in recovery, people who know what it's like to be scared and alone and experiencing a mental health crisis to be able to make that first intervention. So we're really challenging what we think about Black and Brown people experiencing mental health crises and the responses that they deserve. And we believe through Danielle's Law, we can ensure that people get the real care they deserve, especially by censoring peers. And I'll turn it over to Senator Brooke to chime in on the role of racism in this.
Thanks, Stanley. I think Stanley, as always, covered really the crux of how this approach changes. I think the thing that I would add is that oftentimes we talk about our approaches to the work, even as legislators, right? How do you approach a problem? How do you approach a bill? And right now, I think most of us have now understood that to not look at something through the lens of historic racism, you're going to miss the mark. If you truly want a program, a system, a law to succeed in the way that you mean it to succeed. And I think that is not something that comes natural for everyone, but I think that the more of us in a room who understand that basic kind of historical context, it allows us to make decisions that are actually going to help people. One of the things that I always think about is when we're trying to fix something, right? When we're trying to improve something, you have to look at where it is most broken, right? And who it is most broken for. And if we can solve that piece of it, most likely the rest of it will be solved as well. And so I think that is truly, we were part of this process of putting this Danielle's Law together, and the conversation was really around that. It was, how do we right the wrongs that we are living today? And how do we make sure that if we are doing this, that we do it in a way that accounts for the realities of our current systems, not the intentions of our current systems, but what's actually happening so that we can actually right those wrongs. And that shows up in a number of ways. It shows up in who sits on the state council, who sits on the regional councils. It shows up in how we recruit people to actually be in these, mental health response units, who's actually showing up. How do we recruit people and retain them in these roles as mental health providers? And how do we make sure that those folks are from the community that they're serving? Because we know the statistics say when you have people from a community serving a community, outcomes improve, safety improves. Communities are more stable. You have fewer adverse outcomes. And so as a legislator, it's really important to me to always be grounded in that and to remind both myself at times and also my colleagues as we think about moving this through the legislature, that this is the reason we're doing it. And we can't lose sight of that. And we can't lose sight of the community members who, as Stanley rightfully put so much on the line to get us where we are. And I think that is part of our approach, in addition to a lot of what Stanley added.
Some of you know that I've been an advocate for 30 years. I've worked with a lot of senators and assembly members. You can imagine how unique Senator Brooke is, because I can tell you that there's very few people that hit the ground running with this kind of passion and intelligence and perspective. Just amazing, Senator. I put some things in the chat box, but I noticed someone said, when we say mental health, we forget substance use and addiction. Anybody just want to take a quick comment about that? Or you just want to emphasize that?
Yeah, I would love to emphasize, and I do apologize. Usually every time I say mental health crisis, I usually say substance use, but you may have caught me that I missed a couple times today. But I do want to reassure folks, especially as I do my work in the Senate, I work very closely with Senator Harckham, who is the chair of the Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Committee in the Senate. And actually we had him here in Rochester to show him a little bit about how that works here in Rochester. But absolutely, you are 100% right. There is so much overlap with those two conditions. And I think there should be likewise the same overlap in the work that we're doing. So that's a great point. Thanks to whoever made it.
Chaka Mathai had to leave. Chaka Mathai, you may remember, was the associate executive director here at NYAPRS some years ago, and has worked, in a SAMHSA grant, ran a SAMHSA TA Center on Cultural Competence. He's a hero of mine, and I know many people here. He asks, Senator, I'm hoping you can help us address the disproportionate number of BIPOC who are on court orders or involuntarily outpatient commitment. Ideally, we would fund the community-based services such that our communities of color actually need, rather than provide them with the services they actually need, rather than force us into existing care system. This starts with the lack of alternatives and how we address crisis, as you were saying as well.
Yeah, this is such an important point. I definitely hear this. And, to even take it even more broadly, if we recall this year, some folks were trying to make involuntary commitment even easier to do. And one of the immediate flags that went up for me was that I know exactly who this is going to target the most, right? We know how these kinds of policies fall out in this country. And so I couldn't agree more. It's something that we have to take a very hard look at and not allow the expansion of making it even easier to involuntarily commit folks. But this right here is the exact issue that we're talking about on a broader level, right? We are trying to create more community-driven, community-based, more alternatives to addressing folks at different moments in their crisis. And I think that's the problem. And not to get too much on my soapbox, but this is essentially the same problem we have in our health system overall, right? Our health system essentially wants you to get the sickest you get, and then you're forced to go get care, right? We don't make it easy. We don't have a plethora of community clinics in cities and rural areas for you to get your checkup. We don't make it free. We don't have free healthcare in this state. So there's so many pieces of our healthcare and therefore our mental health care system that kind of pushes you towards wait till you need it. Wait till you absolutely need it. Wait until you're in a crisis and you have no other choice but to get the highest amount of care, whether it be inpatient or in this case, outpatient, or being involuntarily committed, right? And we've really failed people in terms of how do you maintain? How, when you are feeling close to a crisis, do you get care in that moment? And that's where things like the crisis stabilization centers come in. It's where things like a lot of the community-based organizations come in that do this work, and really giving them funding to do this work and to keep, because the truth is they have more practitioners from the actual communities that they serve than any other large institution, and making sure that we're allowing them to continue that work. But I mean, he's making a fantastic point that our entire system pushes us towards those highest moment of crisis, that peak moment of crisis, and then you're kind of forced, literally forced, into this type of programming without seeing what could have been done months before, weeks before. And that, when I talk about paradigm shift of how we deal with crisis, we're also kind of elongating what we call crisis, right? So a smaller crisis, you might feel comfortable calling 988 if you know you can just talk to someone and get over that hump, right? You don't have to wait until it's a major crisis and then all of a sudden someone's calling, emergency services, and you don't know what your fate holds. And I think that is part of the shift we're trying to create, which is an uphill battle because it is the opposite of everything this country has created. We're not a preventative people. We're just not. And so we need to shift how we think about care because we need to avoid situations just like that, which was described.
Just so for the audience, and most of you know, everybody on this screen, every single person has been against involuntary outpatient commitment. And this year, the state wanted to expand involuntary inpatient commitment. Right now, the standard is dangerous self for others. They were going to lower it, so many more people would be forced into treatment. And I think the point we've made for a long time is let's not force people into the same services that fail them. Let's improve the services and put them up front earlier, and when possible, peer run. So I just want to reiterate that this is a big issue for everybody in NYAPRS. Let me look for another point here. There was one I had here. Oh, just in the chat box, Peter Brown's former budget director of OMH some time ago. And if you look in the chat box, he points to a SAMHSA piece, National Guidelines for Behavioral Health Crisis. So you may want to download that and have a look at it. Let me see what else we have. Any other questions? We only have a few minutes anyway. Well, let me look into my questions then. What are your priorities, Senator, for the coming session?
Well, I think I went through a couple of them earlier, but certainly a huge, huge priority is to make sure that we get the funding that we need, adequate funding for 988 so that we can be successful with that. That is a tremendous priority. And the second one is the same for Daniel's Law. This is something that has huge support. In fact, might I add, bipartisan support for Daniel's Law, which anyone who has spent any amount of time in Albany knows that's not necessarily a given ever. So the fact that even folks across the aisle for me at least, have understood the need for something like this and the need to shift completely the way we are dealing with mental health crisis is incredibly heartening to me. But we're going to need a massive, massive push because we still have a long ways to go. Anyone who has looked at Daniel's Law knows this is a major, major shift in policy. And I know it's an aggressive timeline to get it done in one term. But I also think the moment is right now, and it has never been clearer that mental health needs to be a priority in every way, shape, or form. And so, so that's my second major priority.
Thank you. Shago had one more point to make, and it's very local. He said, follow up to outpatient commitment. Unfortunately, here in Rochester, police are still determining whether the person in crisis teams even gets called in. It's become difficult to be sure that calling 911 or maybe even 988 would result in a non-coercive, non-punitive intervention by police or mobile crisis. So
yeah.
Yes,
he makes a good point, and I also just want to give time if Stanley wants to add anything, because this is Rochester specific, and I know that she's close to it. But while you think, I can add my 2 cents, Stanley. Just that, you know, the person in crisis team here in Rochester was technically a pilot, so there was a lot of learnings that I think that they took in during that time, and I would believe that the next phase of that. There may be changes to how that works out. Of course, I can't speak for that. I don't run that program or work for the city, but I would hope that there would be some learnings and some evolution there. The other piece is with 988, he's making a very good point, and this is exactly why we need to make sure that we get the funding for 988 to build it out separately. This is not an extension of 911. This isn't one person in a 911 dispatch center is taking 988 calls. This is a standalone program that is specifically for mental health. It takes a completely different approach. As I said, it's not about dispatching people, but rather about resolving if they can, even via phone and text. So I do think that that's going to be important, and that's what we're going to really have to stick to. The good news is, because we passed that 988 bill, right? Because we have that, we do have that out already written in law, what 988 does, what it is, what it needs to look like. And now it's a matter of getting funding so that we can stick to that framework. But that's the hope, is that it's no longer just dispatching law enforcement, but rather has its entire own ecosystem, which of course we're building piece by piece here, but that has its own ecosystem of mental health response unit that's coming, or a referral to a crisis stabilization center. So that would be the goal for 988, and not to simply be feeding into the existing 911.
Thank you, Senator.
Harvey, can I just mention the 988 piece there? Hi, Senator. You know, what goes in line with that is I sit on the 988 coalition here locally in the Hudson Valley, and it really goes down to the leadership of the community, from county government down into the community as to what the needs are. So as we're discussing 988, we're talking about all the challenges that will come with it, which could be resource, development. And we're fortunate to have a stabilization center here, but not every community does. We have mobile teams, not every community does. So there are a lot of moving parts that need to be put into place. And I think there needs to be, and I think that's one of our 988 groups, is to kind of put that puzzle together as to what is a community going to need, whether it's rural or city or whatever. But there is going to be an additional burden on the system once 988 starts, and are we prepared for that? And that's where we're trying to head that off.
You two will have a lot more to talk about it because the center is coming down to visit your program, Steve, later in the year. So, Steve, you have the last word.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Senator Burke was saying. And when it comes to ensuring that we have an appropriate response that's centering peers and mental health, we can't lose sight, just because the person in crisis team exists, it doesn't mean that it's truly giving us what the community is asking for and what our people deserve. What we deserve is a response grounded in the lived experience of peers, of mental health counselors, and people who really are trained to provide real services that are aimed at healing and not, violence or punishment. So I would just say stay vigilant and keep an eye out for what comes next with Danielle's Law and how we as a community can organize to ensure that peer voices are uplifted and we provide appropriate services to the community.
Well, we've found a saying, when people talk like you do, you're in the family of NYAPRS. Well, both of you are deep in the family of NYAPRS. Welcome to our family and welcome to the webinar today. Thank you, Senator. I know you have to run, and we'll be watching closely what you do and what you say. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, our next speaker is Steve Michio. And we were talking about crisis stabilization, and we were talking about local resources, and Steve will tell you more about, but I've known and watched Steve for years, and he is a force of nature, truly, around peer support, innovation, alternatives to criminal justice, more than I can even say. So I want to give you some props, Steve, but I also know you have a lot to say about your program, and it fits so squarely with this program today. So please do.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, and thank you for inviting me to this. It's always important to share what we're learning and what we're doing in our communities and how we can all work together to make things better. And so just to go back, we are the originators of the crisis respite houses, the respite homes, the peer run. We are a peer run organization. Our mantra is that hope greets you at the door and recovery is the expectation for everyone we serve. And we have built a philosophy in our organization that is really unlike many that we've seen, where every staff person really embraces the value of recovery, the value of the lived experience, and the value of mutuality. And it shows in the work we do. So since we've opened respites, which is 21 years ago, we opened the first one here in New York. We now have 4. Those are 24-hour, 7-day facilities that people can go to. They are like a bed and breakfast with really great support when you get there because it is peer run. You're greeted in a very warm way. You're engaged in a very empathetic way. And the whole reason I created it was to get to the heart of the crisis for the individual, to get them to a place where they can think differently for themselves, think of their crises differently, and learn from the environment and the peers that work in the houses on the choices that they can choose to move forward with, instead of, really, it was really designed to break the cycle of home crisis hospital. And it has been 98% effective in doing that over the 21 years that we've been doing this. Even when we look back 2 years, people don't use hospital emergency rooms anymore. They come to us, or they use our stabilization center or our mobile staff. And we have a lot of mobile staff out there in the communities as well. A lot of this is about addressing your current, your current crisis situation and world. I constantly tell my staff, we're not a crisis organization, yet we run all these crisis services. But the reason I say that is because we are not the people in crisis. It's the people we serve that are in crisis. And so there's a whole wellness approach to the staff of my organization that if we start owning others' crises, we become a crisis organization. If we respond appropriately and educate and support the people that are in crises, we stay healthy, and the people we serve have a better outcome and a better interaction and engagement with the people we serve. So I think that's just really important to understand how we treat people differently from our perspective compared to a traditional perspective, which is very reactive to crisis. Let's medicate the person and calm them down first, then maybe we'll talk to them, that kind of approach. We don't believe in that. It doesn't work for many people, so we don't use it. The Stabilization Center is a 24-hour facility, 7 days a week that people can walk in. They don't have to make an appointment. They don't need a referral. They just come and see us. That too is, we had just, I actually designed the Stabilization Center here in New York, and we opened it, but the county government was running it at the time. And they finally figured out after a couple of years that even though they ran it, they didn't run it the way to the vision of what I had created it for. And they did turn it over to my organization, which is in November of last year. And we have been having the best time redesigning the center and engaging the people that are coming in a very healthy and different way. And that has been extremely successful and is getting more successful as we get the word out about us, or as the word gets out about us. And just recently, in the last couple of months, we're serving about 20 people a day that are coming in. And they don't stay more than 24 hours. It's not licensed beyond 24 hours, but they don't need to. What I also had to do was work with my communities in saying, we're going to open this center, but within 24 hours, we want them in your services. We don't want to be the one that providing all the services. If it's a clinic, if it's a partial hospitalization, if it's an outpatient, or if it's an inpatient rehab, regardless of what the discipline is or healthcare, we want you to be a partner with us in serving these people within 24 hours. So eliminating, many people will say I have to wait 6 weeks for a psychiatry appointment, or I have to wait 4 weeks for a clinic appointment. That's not fair to anybody. So we have made it very fair that people will get those services within those 24 hours. The most important thing I think that people should know about our respites and our forensic mobile team and our stabilization center is the follow-up. We follow up with the people we serve when they want us to, and we make sure that they're still getting the services that they deserve, or if they're not, they come back to us, and then we advocate and get them into those services. That, I think, has been a big component in mental health and behavioral health and addiction, everything, for years and years, where there has been no follow through for the people we serve. And that's why they fall through the cracks. And we don't want that to happen in our organization any longer, and it doesn't. And so that's a huge part of it. So people often ask, what do people come to Stabilization Center for? Well, they're dealing with suicidal ideation, they're dealing with voices, they're dealing with depression, they're dealing with just anger, rage, whatever it is, that they would normally present at an emergency room, they would come to us. If it is a medical issue, we will utilize either the hospital emergency room or the FQHC up the street from us to address those medical issues. If it was a behavioral issue that was beyond our scope, because we don't have nurses, we do have clinicians, we do have mostly peers, we have CASACs, we have recovery coaches, and we have case management there as well. And we have a family therapist there too, to address across the lifespan, everybody that comes in, but we're not a medical model. And I didn't want to become a medical model, because if somebody was really seeking medication, well, then the clinic should be providing that with them, or their doctor or somebody else should be providing that service to them. It shouldn't have to be us, because they're usually connected or were connected to those services, and they may have disconnected, but we'll reconnect them. And that's what we do. So the average stay at the stabilization center is about 6 hours. And it's not because we're trying to rush anybody out. It's because we're finding resolution for people within that time frame. If you ever watch my staff, they are just busy on the phone and making calls and transporting and getting people to where they got to go. And they do it, and they do it really well. People do stay over sometimes overnight because they're going to sober up, or they just are exhausted. And so we have no issue with people staying the full 24 hours, but generally they don't really have to. And what's nice about it too is if they need the Rose House or the respite, they can go right from there to the respite. If they need addiction services, we have providers that will come and pick them up, which has been very successful. So it's building relationships, it's holding providers' feet to the fire, it's providing an engaging, safe, trauma-informed environment for people to calm down so they can breathe and get through that. And then it's following up and making sure that the services that they deserve are being delivered in the community. I do have a forensic mobile team, just real quick.
No, I was going to ask you about that. That's good.
Okay. Which is also extremely successful at alternatives to incarceration, at addressing, it's not so much a co-responder model. My staff can be called by police though. We have great relationships with the police departments down in the White Plains area. I think we're working with 9 different police departments. And they will call my team. My team will then dispatch and go to where the officer might be or where the person might be. They'll introduce themselves to the individual and they'll get them on a recovery path that they're willing to take. You know, it's again, all voluntary. But we do go to court with people too, in addition to on the streets. And we work with the judges and have made some huge inroads with the court systems, where the judges have begun to trust us to make sure that we're working with the individual and getting them to where they're going to get better service and better outcomes and better quality of life. So it's a lot of moving parts, but it's really about the characteristics of hiring the right staff, having the right attitude, the right philosophy in your organization, supporting your staff, supporting your teams, and expecting great things from them. And that's how we run the organization here.
Thank you, Steve. So you have a continuum of services, and your forensic precedes the stabilization center. You try to do prevention work there, right?
Yeah.
Then there's the stabilization center. You try to keep it as little as possible. Where do they go next? Where, and what does people have where they could go next?
Well, we have a lot of services. We have housing, we have employment services, we have recovery center services, we have engagement centers. You know, we have a whole host of peer services. We're also embedded in the traditional services too, where we're in the partial hospitalization, we're in the clinics, so what's nice about it is we can introduce them to those traditional services, and we can help them to navigate those services by teaching them how to advocate for themselves, what to ask for, how to go to a therapist and talk to them, and how to, you know, start to build some trust between a psychiatrist and therapist, if needed. But again, the follow-up is important because we want to make sure that they're getting the service that they go to. So whether it's a detox or a rehab or a partial hospitalization or clinic, whatever it is, we ask permission of the individual, and they usually give it, and we follow up within 24 hours to say, did you get there? Did you like the service? Is there anything else you need? And they do come back to stabilization, or they do use our warm line, our support line, to call in to say they're still kind of having problems, or they use our Rose houses. So there's always a fallback, which is what I wanted to build into our system, that if they're not getting exactly what they need at that time, they can still get it from us. And so that tends to really help people stay connected and trust us to help them move along their continuum.
I got 3 minutes, Steve. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions. This is a lightning round. How do we replicate what you're doing for people who are dealing with addiction?
Yeah, you know, I always say it's a common sense approach to understanding the people you serve. And so it's building relationships with the addiction world, the wellness world, and finding out who the better service providers are out there. Also advocating and holding their feet to the fire to say, you know, we've gotten a lot of complaints because of this. So it's, again, that engagement, that communication, the transparency You know, I want to hear the same thing about my organization. If we're not doing something right, we're going to correct it. So I think it's really about that honest approach to really treating the community the way they should be treated.
So if somebody says 6 hours is amazing for engagement. The average ED stay for someone revived from Narcan is less than 4 hours. So they're, you know, someone like me asked you from the beginning, it's only a day. And you said, yeah, it's just, we can do it in a few hours. And here's a person sort of mirroring that. One last question, and I know you have the answers. What does your stabilization center space look like physically now that you've redesigned it? Is it like a bed and breakfast?
It's getting there. It depends on our funding. So I have to use unrestricted or different funds to do a lot of the decorating that we're doing. But we put carpets down and we put our plants in, and we got a better food vendor that we're working with. We're working with an organization that provides food subsidies, and so we're bringing in the right foods, healthier foods. And as we move along, we'll be repainting the facility, changing out some of the furniture. If I had the opportunity, I would redesign some of the more public areas where people get to rest or just have privacy. But we're building in, nice couch components and smaller areas for people to be comfortable in. So it's a work in progress, but it's much better than it was.
So I just want to make a comment, an observation, which is you're not against the medical model, and you work with them, but you're basically an alternative.
Yeah.
And would it be safe to say that if I have a concern that people going to a stabilization center, unlike yours, more traditional, the person coming in will be seen more as a cluster of symptoms, a diagnosis, and go right to medication. But you're the opposite of that. You don't start there, right?
No, we just start with addressing the person, welcome them to the center. We're glad they're there. How can we help you today? We talk about who we are, why our approach is different, and how we respect people. We even go over the documentation, the paperwork with them, and explain them why we're doing it. We don't just sit there and ask questions and do check boxes and things. We say we're doing this because we have to do this, number one, for funding, but we also want to get to know you. So it's more of a motivational interview process of going through that stuff.
I want to thank OMH, by the way, for making the funding not only Medicaid but commercial. So there won't be this thing where you go into the stabilization center and they got to establish your insurance, who the payment is, you're in. And Steve's going to get paid. Steve, thank you so much. We made it just right in time here.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate all your work. And we're going to move on to the next speaker. We've talked a lot about, we talked earlier about alternatives to police. We talked about Daniel Pruitt's tragedy, and could we have sent someone else, somebody different, something different that, not to just sort of diminish the police. And I'll be asking, what do you think the correct role of police is, Christina? But could you mention a little bit about cahoots, but then really get into what your model is and what you're espousing today?
All right. Thank you, Harvey, for having me here today. I am a steering committee member of Correct Crisis Intervention today and a Fountain House advocacy advisor. And I'm also a person with lived experience. So I'm a mental health peer. As for Correct Crisis Intervention today, it was founded by Carla with Benefits back in 2012. It's a grassroots organization, about 80 organizations with over 400 stake owners, including organizations like the NAMI, Fountain House, New York Lawyers of the Public Interest, and more importantly, peers. Peers are on there because we need to be at the table at all times. So CCIT's goal is to divert people experiencing emotional crisis away from the criminal legal system and having peers and an EMT respond to mental health calls. We want people to be connected to the community supports like respite centers, like Steve Michio, right? Mentioned about therapeutic care, non-clinical approach, having people listen to you, just engaging with you. So because people, when peers are in crisis, they need that connection so they can recover easily. What do we want? What we know about peers is that peers are important because we have lived experience. We're trained in cultural competency. We have de-escalation techniques, and we problem solve. Peers know exactly what a crisis looks like and what recovery looks like. We're credible messengers, we share personal stories, we create safe spaces, and we empower and uplift people. So you asked about the CAHOOTS model. CCIT's model is based on the Eugene, Oregon model of CAHOOTS, which is called Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. CAHOOTS has a 2-person model where there's like a nurse, a paramedic, and EMT, which is dispatched to an emergency call. What is great about CAHOOTS is that 75% of the crisis workers are peers. This is evidence that CCIT, NYC, and New York City can work to respond to mental health crisis calls. And over the last year, CAHOOTS handled 24,000 calls, and about 20% of those calls were dispatched by 911. CAHOOTS, in addition, CAHOOTS team for police had police backup 250 times only, which is only 1% of the calls. So that's a very successful model. And out of 30 years, CAHOOTS, they didn't have any major energies to the responders and responders. But despite the success in CAHOOTS, locally in New York City, people were dying from our default New York City, mental health response system. From 2015 to 2020, 18,000 NYPD officers were trained, CIT trained, which is crisis intervention trained, to cost that 5.3 million of city taxpayer dollars. Yet 15 out of 18 people who were killed by the police during that period were people of color. So the CIT response and the police response wasn't working. So again, CCIT, our organization, and in addition to that, not only we want EMT and one peer to respond and a diversion from the criminal legal system, we want a 988 response or an alternative number. So people could be, when mental health calls come in, they don't go to 911, they go to a 988 number so people could directly be connected to a mental health response. We also want an oversight committee, mental health response committee consisting of 51% peers. It's important that peers are always at the table. As we say in our community, nothing about us without us. We should be part of the design, the planning, implementation, and evaluation of these programs and policies, and vetting our service providers before we engage with them, because we want safe outcomes. Let me show you some slides. Let me just share my screen real quickly. One second. Let's see. Sure. So again, here's our model for CCIT NYC, the EMT and one peer trained peer responder. The model that we have is for 2 precincts, which is the 75th and the 14th precinct in New York City. We were going to dispatch 4 vans to transport people in distress to respite centers and shelters or to 24/7 urgent care clinics. The great thing about urgent care clinics, we all know about them. If a city MD is some kind of urgent care, they're just about on every corner, like a Starbucks and McDonald's right now. And if we had an urgent care clinic in just about every corner, we can also have not just a medical, we can have a therapist or mental health clinic within these urgent care clinics where people can go in there to speak to someone when they're unwell. If they have to get treatment in some way or form, they can go there for the supports because it's within their community and they don't have to go to a hospital or be, 911 has to respond. Again, I mentioned the 988 number, the precincts that we were going to use, and this is the course, $16.5 million for a 3-year program, and the oversight committee, which we want. Oops. So again, here are the people who have been killed over the 5-year period by NYPD. One in particular that we know from Fountain House is Deborah Dana. Deborah Dana was a person living with schizophrenia, and she had a relationship with the NYPD in her community. However, when her sister called for her to get supports from the police department, they sent someone in who was not trained, who was not culturally competent, who did not know how to engage with Deborah Dana properly. She's on the top right of the column on the top. And instead of closing the door, he shot her multiple times and he didn't go to jail for it. So that's sad, and this needs to stop. In addition to that, we have a New York City Be Heard program. New York City implemented a program, a non-response police response to their program in New York City, and it's called the Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division, which was launched in 2021. This is the mayor's response program, and it's this is their public health response, which covers 3 precincts in Harlem. Their team is going to be a social worker and a fire department. Police and EMT respond to imminent danger, and police responds after hours. Their steering committee was only city agencies, which you see is FDNY, New York City Health and Hospitals, DOHMH, NYPD, and the mayor's office, and there was no community input. The advocates' concerns were that the Thrive's own estimate said that was 30% of the time police were going to respond, right? And that's too much. We don't want police to respond. And moreover, that they control the response, like the 911 calls. Their entire program was handled by the city agencies. There were no requirements to hire peers, which we want peers as advocates. And their response time is going to be up to 30 minutes. Now, when you think about a person in crisis, people could be in crisis. Like if they respond to an emergency 911, if a person's having a heart attack or they broke their leg or got hit by a car, they respond to 8 to 12 minutes according to city records. But how come peers of people living with mental health crisis have to be a response by 30 minutes, which isn't right? So we need a shorter response time for people living with mental health concerns who are in crisis. The pilot was only going to be for 16 hours. We need a 24-hour response. And they really didn't have any outcome or metrics. And again, the peer and the community wasn't involved in establishing the program. Just most recently, as the report for June, when the program launched, the Be Heard's reports were right here. They said that out of the report that the traditional 911 response, 20% of the people responding responded to 911 and 80% were able to respond to the Be Heard program. So the Be Heard program was effective. Also, when you look at the reports, NYPD requested on-site assistance from Be Heard 14 times, as opposed to the Be Heard team only requested supports from the police, not 7% of the time. But reports have reported out from Commissioner O'Shea that 85% of the time that police have to respond. So there's conflicting data to this. So that's what I have for CCIT right now.
Thank you, Christina. Here's a question from local Rochester, an important person in the world of crisis intervention teams. And Don, we've had a lot of discussions around peers and clinicians and police and EMTs. Your question here is, can you help us understand why EMTs are needed? What percentage of CAHOOTS calls needed an EMT? Some folks are concerned that peer EMT model, as opposed to the peer mental health professional model, just want to say peers are professionals too, eliminates trained mental health professionals as part of the crisis response. So I guess the question is, I guess this presumes, I'm going to just take a shot at this, Don, a little bit. It presumes that a peer is not a trained mental health professional, I guess. So if they are, then going with an EMT would still have one there. But you're making a different point, I know, which is that a peer clinician, you're wondering why that wouldn't be a better paradigm than a peer and EMT. And by extension, you're saying, why do you need them? Do you want to take a crack at that, Christina?
Kind of not understanding the question, but to me, a peer, a person with lived experience, is a mental health professional, because we know what our diagnosis is, we know our behaviors, and we know personally how what we need for our recovery. So I consider myself a mental health professional, right? An EMT needs to be there for any medical stuff. So if a person is having diabetes, heart attack, or whatever, because a lot of times if you have diabetic issues can look like you're having a behavioral problem at the same time. So you need someone to check your vitals at the same time, check your mental health. So you do need an EMT there. Is that kind of answering the question?
Well, I think, I'm done. I'm going to give you the last word. I also
I don't know the percentage either. I don't know the percentage of the CAHOOTS calls.
I put you run the Institute for Police Mental Health Community Collaboration, do a lot of the major CIT training in New York. If you're still with us, if you want to have any follow-up.
Harvey, if I could just jump in for a second. I think that there are some people who are also concerned about having mental health professionals as a part of that first response because of the history of the clinical and medical model having coercion involving, and how the peer model and peer support is a totally different model that is based on compassion and engaging, and person-centered, self-directed. So it's a very different approach than a clinical approach.
I agree with you, because the clinical approach it's more focused on diagnosis, maintenance, and stabilization, which involves medication. And as you said, Cameron, it's more of a person-centered approach, engaging people, using strength-based language, and it's more like taking your time, getting to know the person and being patient, listening actively, listening to what the person needs to be able to address what they need and keep them safe. Right.
Speaking of that, Christine, let me ask you the corollary. Someone's running through the streets, they've taken PCP or they're in some sort of a state, and they're running through traffic. So there's some danger there. And how would the peer EMT model handle that? And if police were needed, how would that happen?
So for me, I don't have the substance abuse background. And so
Let's just say a mental health condition.
Right, the mental health. So I don't have the co-occurring. I don't know anything about the substance use, but
Yeah, okay.
Right. But if I saw a peer that was just in general, if I didn't know if he had substance use background or not, I would kind of probably, I would probably run along with them to see what was going on and have a conversation. I was jogging next to them, say, hey, I'm here to support you. What's going on? So I'm meeting them where they're at.
Wow.
And I'm listening as they're screaming and venting, because it's like there's pain, emotional pain going. It will tell me what's going on. I'm not getting the police involved. The person's not harming me. I'm keeping my distance because I don't want them to feel that I'm, being intrusive. And until they slow down, because you can't snap out of a mental health condition or substance abuse. It may take an hour, and eventually you wind down, and I'm there. I got you. I got your back.
And I love that, and it's so to the heart of peer support. But if they were running, I'm just trying to see when is police needed. If they're running in front of cars and someone's going to get hurt, would you,
Right.
when do you call the police and how do you do that? And would they get there fast enough?
Right. I mean, yeah, I would for me, I would call the police to stop the traffic. Right. Don't engage into the person, go to the police, stop the traffic. Person's not hurting himself. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's just running out there. His brain is like not there right now. So I'm going to engage with the person. You stop the traffic and let's take it from there.
I'm looking to see. Well, thank you. I think we've run out of time. Christina, thank you so much. And I know we're strongly behind your campaign, and Carla, and you'll be speaking at our conference as well. I put that chat link in earlier about different models of police alternatives. So thank you for your work and your commitment, your passion. Our next speaker, so we've talked about keeping people out of hospital and trying to keep people out of emergency room. And this part will be how do you keeping people out of jail and prison. And I have to say, this is the most compelling, painful issue I've ever worked in, because right now, our people are in a little box the size of an elevator with a little sort of small window to get out, and they get out very infrequently. It is an outrage, and it is something that led NYAPRS to be sort of the mental health face of the campaign for alternatives to isolated confinement. And you couldn't ask for a better leader and partner than Jerome Wright. So Jerome, would you explain to us, like, if people do have to go to prison, how does the HALT legislation that we worked on change the conversation from torture to treatment?
First of all, thank you, Harvey. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank NYAPRS in particularly, and then all of the groups who've worked with us, like Free the People Rock, who helped make this HALT Solitary Confinement Act into the law. It was a long, arduous process, and what it really did is it changed from torture into treatment, from trauma to therapy, and from punishment to progressive rehabilitation. And that's the ultimate goal in itself. HALT bans those with mental health illness from ever seeing the inside of a solitary confinement cell. That was a major win, and one of the clauses that we fought hard not to make any compromises on, because as you so eloquently said, man, a 6x9 cell alone with mental health issues is a recipe for disaster, either suicide, death, self-mutilation, exacerbating the already underlying illness, and worse, if there is a such thing. It also requires legal representation for anybody charged with an offense that would place them in a solitary confinement situation. It codifies the behavior that warrants placement in solitary, because up until this law, you can go to solitary for any reason an officer or civilian staff member wanted to put you in that cell for 23 hours a day. But the one thing that the pinnacle of it is that no one, and I repeat, no one can spend more than 15 consecutive days in a cell. And even when they have to do that for adjudication reasons, there's mandatory out of cell time, there's mandatory congregate activities, and there's mandatory therapy and treatment, something which should have been mandated way before HALT was passed, but now is a must. So, the goal is to ban solitary everywhere for everybody, but this is the first step in that direction. So it would prevent people who get locked up if they have a mental health issue for even being placed in a cell like that. Secondly, if they find themselves being placed in a cell like that, we have lawyers that will be there and other legal minds that would help them fight against these charges, most of the time, which are not real charges to begin with, but somebody's subjective opinion about something. Or, as you know, we've criminalized mental health in this country. So a lot of the aberrant behavior that guys get into that would get them in a solitary situation is the result of maybe an underlying mental health issue that nobody has diagnosed or dealt with. Now they will get help and treatment and not just perpetual punishment and torture. And that's what makes it such a revolutionary change, because the paradigm of punishment has been broken down. It hasn't been eviscerated, and that's the next step. And right now we're in a bit of fight because New York City is trying to pass off a fake ban of solitary by creating a cell within a cell within a cell that they say is attended to out of cell placement, and as well as some resolve to ending solitary. And nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, it even is worse than what the current solitary situation is, if you look at it in its total practice, the way they tend to try to get it. So the battle is not over. The partners of NYAPRS and NYAPRS, we're going to need you as much now as we ever did. And I know your commitment. And I'm just so happy to know that you will be continue this fight alongside us so that we can make sure that people are not tortured and traumatized any more than prison already does. And that we give people the help they need to return to society, better able to make that a successful and smooth transition and become the type of law-abiding citizens we all want each and every person to be.
Can you see why Jerome is my hero out there? Amazing individual. Jerome, you got about 4 minutes. Can you talk about racism in the criminal justice system? Racism, mental health in the criminal justice system?
I don't know how you can talk about the criminal justice system and not talk about racism, because the pinnacle of the whole genesis of the system is behind racism. The whole genesis of policing is about racism, bringing back slaves or capturing people and making them slaves. Racism permeates every spectrum of criminal justice, and particularly when it comes to jails and prisons, Black, Brown, and Latinx people get the brunt of everything, whether it is solitary confinement, whether it is the lack of services, whether it is being treated in a way that is subhuman. This is something that permeates. And what my real thing, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that when you treat somebody like an animal or subhuman, how do you ever expect them to comport themselves as the human beings you want them to be and suggest that they should be? That's just not, there's no way to quantify that. If you're going to treat people with respect and dignity, then you can almost guarantee that they will end up acting with respect and dignity and treating others that same way. But when you treat people like animals, slaves, and subhuman, then you cannot expect anything but that type of reciprocity.
Jerome, we say in mental health, particularly in working with communities of color, staff should look whenever possible like the people they serve, and relate to the culture and relate to their experience. You know this, in prisons, is there a percentage of COs that are people of color, an adequate percentage?
No, there's no adequate percentage. But that's a tricky situation there, because once you become a part of a system, Black officers, Hispanic officers, Asian officers, they tend to comport themselves the same way as the racist Caucasian officers, because they're in an environment, one, that's what the attitude and the emphasis is, but also for their own personal safety, they feel they got to act like they got to toe the company line, because if you don't, when you pull your pin and you are in problems, they might not show up. So you feel compelled, and then you buy into it. And sooner or later, you're no better than the person who is the avowed racist, because you're following and complicit in their agenda. So it doesn't make a difference. You need to change a system, not the individuals. The system is what's not working the way it's supposed to work. The people are part of the system, and we need to break that system. That's what it is.
Jerome, thank you so much for coming. I know it's your wife's
You're
birthday.
welcome. Yes. So y'all could even tell her happy birthday before I get off, because I'm hopefully that I'll still be married afterwards. And, but thank you guys for hosting this. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you for all the support.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for coming, and happy birthday,
Susan.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's all right. Our final speakers we're actually miraculously on exact schedule, not even like a few minutes off. So we talked about how to keep people out of jail, out of de-escalated crisis, how to help people not go to the hospital, hopefully not get arrested, not get harmed or killed. We've talked about the alternative crisis facilities and 988 and all these alternatives. We just heard about, if you do go to prison, there's a more humane. They've worked 8 years. We came out with them about 3 years ago. It's an extraordinary victory, and I put their website in there. But if you are in jail and prison, the trick is going to be, how do you get out in a way that really is supportive and where you don't come back? There was a time that people would be dropped off at 5 in the morning with $2.50 and no health care. So I know that Matthew and Melissa will introduce themselves, and we'll talk about reentry reforms.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey. I have to go first. Someone's cleaning up in the room that I'm presenting in.
No problem. So first off, I'm the project director here at the Core Center, which is through the Center for Community Alternatives. It's an OASIS-funded recovery community and outreach center. And we wanted to talk about some of the issues around returning from having been incarcerated. Me, someone who has been incarcerated, I think that, and I've also dealt with mental health and substance use issues. And so I can't overstate the importance of access to culturally responsive services and supports during reentry to address underlying issues and the additional trauma that can come with being incarcerated. Changing my life was not easy. I was incarcerated 4 different times. And I just want to say that I'm happy that people thought I was worth another chance and made sure I had access to the right services and supports. Not everyone has this opportunity. There's this thing called Medicaid inmate exclusion provision. And there is some potential to get that waived. There's been some efforts in the past to get that waived. So what happens with the Medicaid program is that New York State submits these amendments to their demonstration project to test different interventions and to test changes that can sometimes be innovative. And Melissa's going to, if she's able to, she's going to walk you through a little bit more around the Medicaid inmate exclusion provision and the potential for there to be a amendment that will waive that exclusion to allow people to have Medicaid before they are potentially 30 days before they're released, to start to plan for a healthy and successful reentry back into the community, to make sure that they can get some of their issues addressed in terms of mental health and substance use issues. And I just want to say that it's an approach that would improve current efforts around public safety, around public health, and around healthcare service delivery. Melissa, are you able to talk right now?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew, for your flexibility and for sharing your story too. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, but while I do, I will say, just to add to what Matthew said, yeah,
Hey, Melissa, will you introduce yourself? What?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Sure.
So my name is Melissa Holloway. I'm a medical student at the University of Rochester. And I am one of the leaders of the health and incarceration group here. So yeah, what I was saying is, to add to Matthew's point, is yeah, the Medicaid inmate exclusion provision really does limit care for a number of individuals, even though people are, 12 times more likely to die of an opioid or drug overdose in the first 2 weeks after they're released. A lot of people with a serious mental health condition who are incarcerated are 75%. There's 75% co-occurrence with substance use disorder. So this is an important thing to address, and access to care is a huge issue. So as Matthew was saying, can you guys all see my screen? You can, okay, cool. Let's make sure. All right, so I'm quickly going to go over what we can do about this inmate exclusion provision. So there are two separate ways to sort of address this. One is on the state level, and one is a federal initiative. So New York State, in 2019, they first tried to submit an amendment to their 1115 demonstration waiver to allow for access to Medicaid 30 days prior to release. That failed. Nothing really came of that. So the Biden administration currently has approved an extension of what currently exists, but that doesn't specifically address needs for individuals with justice involvement. So the state of New York is currently preparing an amendment request, and it has a social determinants of health framework that, as of right now, again, does not address the needs of those who are justice involved. So the few things that we can do once the comment period opens is we can try to address a few things. We can try to expand funding for these services. We can try to increase coverage before release, and we can try to mandate more reporting and accountability for these populations in terms of Medicaid programs and their value-based programs with managed care organizations. So that's something that we sort of have to wait for the comment period to open to talk about, to be able to even request this change. And I know we're running up close on time already, so I'll quickly jump to the federal initiative. There's also a federal initiative that requests a very similar thing, the Medicaid Reentry Act of 2021. Now, this is not the first time this has been introduced in the United States Congress. Representative Tonko introduced it 2 years ago, and it has never made it out of committee. But right now, it's getting a little more traction at the federal level. There are bills in both the House and Senate. I believe in the House, I believe it's in the Senate Finance Committee. Right now, it escapes me which House committee it's sitting in, but the big issue is none of our local representatives are co-sponsors right now. So Gillibrand, Schumer, and Morelli are not listed as co-sponsors on this bill, and that's something that we all have the power to press on them for. There is some movement through community organizations to get this passed with, an upcoming stimulus or infrastructure bill, but it's unclear where that is right now. Hopefully there's movement on that. We get some positive updates. Do you have anything to add to this before we quickly talk about Clean Slate, Matthew?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I think that NYAPRS is going to be active in pumping out when the New York State opens up their 115 demonstration application for public comment. And we're hoping to see this 30-day pre-release coverage in there. There's a bunch of states that have submitted that and it's sitting with CMS. So it's just going to be important that I know NYAPRS, we're going to be submitting a public comment, and there's potentially to spread the word to get other people to comment, and we'll be providing more information on that.
Thank you, Matthew. I had a question, but I lost it. Let me look and see. If you look, by the way, on the right, you'll see how you can join NYAPRS. You can website and download all kinds of great resources. You can start your day doing yoga or meditation. Go to our site. Those are all new recordings, changed every week, I think. But definitely reentry is critical. I will say some tidbit. It's a tidbit, Washington tidbit, which is the reentry language is actually included in the stimulus bill, the one that passed. But groups like that I belong to, the language said that Medicaid could be used by the officers, by the jail itself and the prisons, and people were afraid that's what would grow, would be the jail and prison staff, not the treatment staff or so just there's a little wrinkle there, and just be aware of that. Okay, let's see, are we right on time again? Yep, amazing. So now we have room for you out there to ask any questions. The panel, where am I? The panel can talk to each other. You can talk to the panel. Some of you want to actually talk. I'm trying to find, and if you want to do that, apply to speak up, and we'll open up your mic. I certainly want to thank all of you and congratulate Cameron for organizing a great forum. And you'll see more of these in other parts of the state.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Harvey, for being such a great moderator. And I also want to just thank all the speakers. It was just so informative and inspiring to hear from everyone. And it was just, for me personally, exciting to have everyone together. And I also just want to take a moment to thank everyone who's attending and who interacted with us and whatnot. We're kind of thinking about next steps. So as Harvey mentioned, there'll definitely be more forums in our Finger Lakes region that we'll be doing. And you can find out that information definitely through NYAPRS. Or you have my email, so you can definitely email me directly with any questions related to NYAPRS in our region. I know Stanley had to hop off, but Stanley mentioned, as far as next steps, if you are interested in organizing around the passage of Daniel's Law, to have that be statewide, please email Free the People Rock, and I'm going to put that information in the chat. It's fpproc@riseup.net. And so that's definitely something that we can work on moving forward. There's been a lot of great issues that I think we can continue to move forward on. Obviously, the reentry is going to need some advocating at the critical time. So
yeah. I want to point out too, NYAPRS is ground zero for a lot of the advocacy work that led to some of these things that you're hearing about today. So if you want to continue to support that, we worked hard on stabilization. We worked truth be told, Steve and I went to the state and tried and kind of helped reshape the model. So it was more recovery oriented, truth be told. We worked for the 1% COLA. Senator's been great. We were the first ones to go in and say no forced treatment. She was great. It was DOA once she said that. So, our advocacy, we worked with the Kate group, see the passage of HALT. So please join us in that regard. And even if you're not signing up to be a member, get the e-news and we'll brace you into action and you can talk to us. But we try to have a major role in some of these things that we have, but we can always use more help. So, well, it looks like, I will say one thing though, that the audience basically stayed stable. It only went down when speakers left and then it went back up without those speakers. So I think it was a solid attendance, especially for a first forum. So I want to thank Melissa and Matthew and Len. I know you're hiding back there, and Eileen for all the mechanics and all of what you did in setting it up. And you got to meet some incredible people, Christina, the senator, Steve, Jerome. So, that's what we do. Our conference is coming up. I think I put the link in the, I'll put it again there. It's going to have Senator Brooke. It's going to have, we may be the first conference that has the new top official in Washington from the Biden administration, the new Assistant Secretary for Mental Health Substance Use and new SAMHSA administrator, Dr. Miriam Delphin-Rittman. So please feel free to she's going to be really a wonderful addition to our program. And certainly we'll have Senator Brooke, we'll have all kinds of leaders. We'll have Mary Ellen Copeland. You'll see it in when you go in and look. It's May 21, 23, 28, and 30, mainly in the afternoons and a couple of evenings. I think it's the 23rd and the 28th. But keep a look on an outlook. And if, by the way, we have room for, we train comedians and we set them loose on the stage. We have room for a couple. So if you're interested in being a comedian at the NYAPRS conference and work with national expert David Grenier, give us a shout and we'll get you up there. Okay. Oh, Cameron should be the comedian. Okay, we'll do that, Len. That's a good idea. Okay.
I'll need a lot of help.
He'll give it to you. He really will. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming on. It was a long week, fit a lot into 2 hours, and we got most of it done in an hour and 45. So be on the lookout. Please join our e-news list. If you do anything, join the e-news list. And we'll, even a couple of hours ago, we published that acting Governor Kathy Hochul was going to give a talk, and I think she did, and we'll be sending out the details of that. So thank you for coming. Stay strong, stay safe. We'll see you soon.
Take care, all.